Ever feel like, when you're reading religious texts, some parts are like way more um, action movie than Sermon on the Mount?
Yeah, definitely.
Like today, we're diving into some of that chapters 8 and 9 of the Quran, Surat al-Anfal and Surat at-Tawbah, spoils of war and the repentance. And let me tell you, these chapters do not disappoint if you're looking for intensity.
Oh, absolutely. These chapters really don't shy away from like the gritty realities of conflict and violence. They give us this really fascinating look into a super pivotal moment in, early Islamic history when things were really, really intense.
Totally. It's like we're getting a front row seat to the aftermath of a major battle. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Verses 37 to 40 of chapter 8, they talk about separating right from wrong, the consequences of belief and disbelief. It's heavy stuff.
It is, and you have to imagine, right, being a member of this like new Muslim community, you've just gone through this incredible struggle, and you're grappling with these huge, huge questions. And these verses, they were revealed right at that critical juncture. Wow.
So they provided both like spiritual comfort and practical guidance all in one. And they introduced this really powerful concept, fitna.
Okay, fitna. That sounds kind of ominous, to be honest.
It is a really loaded term. It can mean persecution, chaos, even like the very act of disbelief itself.
Wow.
It's a test of faith with very real consequences.
Yeah.
Imagine the weight of that word, especially in a time of such upheaval.
No kidding. So these verses, I mean, they weren't just like some abstract theological debate, right? They were offering real-time advice on navigating a world that probably felt like it was falling apart.
Absolutely. And the guidance gets surprisingly specific, too. Verses 41, 60, and 62 of chapter 8, and then verse 20 of chapter 9, lay out in detail how the spoils of war should be divided.
Seriously?
Yeah, we're talking a meticulous breakdown.
Yeah.
1/5 going to specific groups. It's really interesting. It's like we're seeing the Quran, like literally crafting the blueprint for how to build a just society, even in the middle of all this conflict.
Yeah.
It's not just about winning a war. It's about what you do afterward, how you behave.
Exactly. And what I find so striking is how much it emphasizes caring for the most vulnerable people.
Yeah.
Verse 41 of chapter 8 says it all. For Allah is 1/5 of it, and for the messenger, and for his near relatives, and the orphans, the needy, and the stranded traveler.
Wow.
Right. It's this incredible statement of like social responsibility. It's woven right into the fabric of these verses about war and conflict.
It makes you think about the values that are like at the very core of these teachings,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
It's not just about like individual piety. It's about coming together and building a society that reflects those values, even in the face of incredible challenges and adversity.
But it's not all like rules and regulations and that sort of thing.
All right.
Chapter 8 takes this like dramatic turn in verses 42 through 44 and 62 and 63. And then we see it again in verses 25, 26, and 40 of chapter 9. Suddenly, we're talking about these moments of divine intervention where God's support is just undeniable, especially during the Battle of Hunain.
Okay, so like picture this, right? You're totally outnumbered. You're about to face this terrifying enemy. And then boom, this wave of divine assurance washes over you.
It's powerful imagery.
It's like those epic battle scenes in movies where the music swells and you know the good guys are about to turn the tide.
Oh,
One of the verses even describes God making the enemy appear few in your eyes to like boost the believer's courage.
talk about a confidence boost. These verses offer incredible reassurance to believers. Like even when things seem completely impossible, God's power can change everything.
So it's all about trusting in something bigger than yourself, even when it seems like you're totally screwed.
Exactly. But here's where it gets really interesting, I think. This whole idea of trusting in God, it's juxtaposed with this very stark warning about the dangers of hypocrisy.
Oh.
Yeah. The Quran does not mess around when it comes to calling out those who claim to have faith, but whose actions don't really line up.
To just talk the talk.
Yep. And this theme, it's front and center as we move into verse 47, and this long stretch from verse 42 all the way to 88 in chapter 9.
It's kind of wild how the Quran just tackles this whole hypocrisy thing
Yeah.
like right out in the open.
Yeah, it's pretty direct.
And it's not just like a general warning either. It gets
Yeah.
into the specifics. Like in those verses we were just talking about, 42 to 88 in chapter 9, it calls out behaviors like making excuses to avoid fighting or spreading rumors,
Yeah.
even criticizing the prophet.
Right. This isn't just about, individual shortcomings. It's bigger than that. It's about what it takes to actually like protect and build a community. And don't forget, right, this is a group of people who are just starting out. They're facing opposition from all sides.
Oh, for sure. So these verses, they're kind of like guidelines for navigating those growing pains and the conflicts that can totally pop up whenever you're trying to build something new with other people.
Exactly. And what I think is super interesting is it doesn't just like point a finger at the people who are stirring up trouble and like end the conversation there, you know?
Right.
Verse 74 in chapter 9, it even talks about forgiveness. For the people who sincerely repent, even if they messed up big time and strayed from the path. So even when it's dealing with these internal conflicts and issues, there's always this like underlying theme of mercy and compassion.
So it's less about like punishing dissent and more about encouraging people to be really honest with themselves and get back to those core principles. Like, look, everyone makes mistakes, but what matters is owning up to them and getting back on track.
Exactly. And this whole emphasis on, like being accountable, sincere belief, all that, it connects directly to the verses that come right after, especially verses 75 and 76 of chapter 9. Those verses talk about wealth and generosity. Specifically, they warn against breaking promises that you've made to God, especially when it comes to charity.
Man, that feels incredibly relevant even now.
Right.
How often do we see people putting on a show of being super religious, but it's all a front? Like their actions don't match up with their words.
All it's test.
It's like the Quran is saying, don't let your faith become some kind of performance. Like true generosity, it has to come from a genuine place.
Absolutely. It's a really powerful message about like what it actually means to be righteous. It's not about how much you give or how loudly you profess your faith. It's about, the intention behind it, the state of your heart.
It really makes you think about those big, timeless questions.
Yeah, totally.
Like, what does it actually mean to live a good life? What does that look like? And how do we balance our responsibilities to, like, ourselves, our communities, and to something bigger than ourselves?
Huge questions. And these chapters, I think they offer us a framework to start thinking about those questions. They remind us that even in the middle of conflict and, knowing that people aren't perfect, there's always a path toward justice and compassion and connecting with, like, something divine.
Man, we've covered a lot of ground. Faith, conflict, hypocrisy, social responsibility. It's almost overwhelming how much these chapters get into. It's like we're watching the birth of a whole society with all its messy and complicated parts.
It's important to remember that these chapters, they weren't like revealed in a vacuum. This wasn't some isolated thing. It happened over time. And they were revealed in response to like very specific challenges that this early Muslim community was facing. Imagine, right, receiving this guidance like right when you need it most.
Wow. It's like they're getting like a spiritual download perfectly timed for what they were going through.
Yeah.
And even though the specific things they were dealing with might seem really far removed from our lives, the core messages they were getting are totally timeless.
Right.
It's like at the heart of it, it's all about the struggles we all deal with, trying to live up to our ideals, building a just society, and finding meaning and purpose when the world feels completely chaotic and unpredictable.
And those struggles definitely haven't gone away.
Not at all.
And as we keep moving through chapter 9, we're going to encounter even more, I think, challenging territory, verses that continue to spark a lot of debate and really require careful, thoughtful consideration.
Yeah, no kidding. Challenging is definitely one word for it.
Right.
These are the verses I feel like that people love to take out of context, to paint like this very specific, and let's be real, often very inaccurate picture of what Islam is all about.
It happens all the time, unfortunately.
We're talking verses 80 through 84 in chapter 9. And the language there, it gets, I don't know, intense. Especially when it's talking about people who chose not to fight or people who criticize those who did.
Yeah.
It feels, honestly, jarring, especially after all that stuff about mercy and forgiveness we were just talking about. It's like, whoa, what happened to all that?
Yeah. It's definitely a shift in tone, but I think it helps to remember what you were just saying about context. You can't just like parachute into these verses without understanding what was going on at the time. This was a community that was literally fighting for its life. I mean, they were up against some very powerful enemies who wanted to wipe them out. So these verses, they're not talking about, just anyone who disagrees with you or decides not to get involved in like every single fight.
Right.
They're talking to a very specific group who were basically refusing to defend the community and were even like actively undermining it from the inside.
So it's not like some general condemnation, but like a very specific message for a very specific situation.
Exactly, and it's really about accountability,
Yeah.
and self-preservation when you're facing that kind of danger. And the Quran, it talks a lot about self-defense, protecting the vulnerable, but it never says, like, go out and be aggressive just because. There's a huge difference there.
Big time. It's a good reminder, I think, that context is everything,
Yeah.
especially with, these ancient texts that have been interpreted and reinterpreted for centuries.
It's so important to look at the whole picture, to try to understand the historical and the social context of these revelations. Because when you just, like, pull verses out without that, it distorts the meaning. And that's
Yeah.
how you end up with these harmful misunderstandings and stereotypes.
It's like that saying, a text without context is just pretext. Like,
Yeah.
these weren't meant to be, Instagram captions. They were meant to help people navigate these incredibly complex, often dangerous situations.
With wisdom.
And compassion.
Absolutely. And they still do that today. They invite us to think about these difficult questions that are still so relevant, even now. Like, how do we balance our individual freedom with, like, the needs of our community? How do we respond to people who seem to, like, threaten our way of life? These are tough questions. But the Quran, it encourages us to really wrestle with those questions, with both, like, strength and mercy.
Yeah.
To look for justice and understanding.
Okay, so we've been through a lot. Battlefields.
Yeah.
Hypocrites. Pleas for generosity. It's a lot to take in.
It really is.
If our listener could only take away one big idea from this whole deep dive, what would you want it to be?
That's a tough one. But I think it would be this. Even though these verses, they were revealed in a very specific time, a very specific place, with very specific challenges, the principles behind them, they're timeless. Justice, compassion, community, fighting against hypocrisy, these things matter in any era. And the challenge for us, just like it was for those early Muslims, is figuring out how to live by those principles in our own complicated world.
So it's like we've got to find those threads of wisdom that are woven through these verses and figure out how to make them part of our own lives, our own choices.
Exactly.
And maybe if we can do that, if we can lead with understanding and empathy, like you were saying, maybe we can start building bridges with each other instead of more walls.
I love that. And I think, I think our listeners have a lot to think about today.
They do. They have a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
So until next time, everyone, keep asking those tough questions. Don't be afraid to dive deep. And we'll be back soon with another deep dive.